All right, welcome aboard, Aaron Carr, the bishop, as Pastor Tyler St. Clair calls him. And Aaron and I have known each other for, actually, I'm totally forgetting now, 2010 was when we met up at Restore?
That sounds about right.
Yeah, and Aaron's the pastor at First Pres in Trenton. Actually, a number of the members of our church might know him or have met him before. And Aaron and I have been friends in a group of pastors that gets together. Is it called Confessional Cohort, or what's the official name?
Yeah, we called it the Confessional Collective.
Confessional Collective. All right. So obviously we lead with that brand because I've been in it for years and didn't know, but I knew it had something about confession. So
Yep.
I come to him.
And that's not confession for your soul. That's a statement of faith. Yeah.
There's no confession or absolution, that kind of thing. It's more right. Yeah, it's all good. Yeah. So
right.
Aaron has been pastoring in Downriver, but also was born and raised in Downriver. And as a Resurrection Church, we've been interviewing different church planners. We've talked with guys like Jason Aaron, and who's doing a residency, or has done a residency with First Pres. So I thought it'd be interesting to get the other side of the coin, because our church is a church plant, but also after the merge is an established church, and we want to be a part of planting more churches. So we're going to do 7 questions, try to shoot for 15 minutes. Usually we go a touch over, but I'll get rolling with them now. All right?
Ready.
Okay. All right. First question. How did you meet your wife?
I met my wife at church.
Good place.
There's a little bit of an age difference between us. So she had she was infatuated with me for a long time. She said when she was a little girl, she was going to marry me. Obviously I didn't have any interest in her for some time, but then God kind of changed my heart. And lo and behold, here I am married to a little girl that actually wrote a letter a long time ago to her teacher at school, because she had to write on something she believed would happen in the future. And she wrote, and she actually got the dates. The date was only off, I think, like a year or something from the time we got married. So I think she's a prophet or a prophetess.
Dude, that's funny. So what's the age gap in years?
There's 7.5 years between us. So
okay. Yeah. So you were in a role at the church somewhere?
Yeah, I was. I went to a school in Clearwater, Florida for my undergrad degree. And so I was gone for some of it when I came back. And I was kind of helping out with kind of like a youth pastor / assistant to the pastor, did some preaching, teaching, Sunday school, that kind of stuff. And so the interaction came after postgraduate. She was kind of moving on up, and so that was the connection.
Yeah. So and small connection, but Resurrection. Richard Stratton served as the president of Clearwater Christian College, I think, after you were gone, right? But
That's right. Yeah.
Aaron's a Clearwater grad, and Richard, Lord willing, we voted on as an elder here when we can gather again, and he was the Clearwater president. So small world. We probably have a grad that went. We have somebody in the church that went there, I think. I don't know, but yeah. So okay, now you got married, and you have how many kids?
We have 3 kids. Our oldest is 15, and then I have a 12-year-old daughter, and then another 7-year-old daughter. So we have a little bit of age gap there. But my son is 15, so he's the oldest.
And are they all in Riverview schools?
We live in Trenton, and so they're all in Trenton schools. We did play Riverview football. I think that's why you think Riverview. I grew up in Riverview, and then I helped coach Riverview football, where my son played Little League, and so we've been pretty invested in Riverview, only because Trenton is pretty much a hockey town. So
that makes sense. Sorry, I thought, because my next door neighbor, they're members, and they go to Riverview, and I was just of the connection. But actually, I forgot it was just football. Yeah.
Yeah. No problem.
Yeah. Is life pretty? Is it okay for them with the stuff? I haven't asked them about.
Yeah. I know our kids. Everybody's good. Obviously, we're during this quarantine time. Our kids are in public school, so this is a big shift for us. So we're doing a lot of homeschooling stuff, obviously now, like everybody else. And we've always done some homeschooling stuff, like as far as Bible curriculum that goes on in our house. But adding all the math and history and all that stuff in there, it's been kind of fun. Yeah, but I think just busy. Life is busy. and yet this has been kind of a good time just to kind of pause and spend time with the fam. So
Yeah. Are they now? Well, I guess I'll skip ahead. I don't want to ask too much family stuff. We got to stay on our 15 minutes. Okay.
that's right.
So,
That's right.
now you came to be the pastor there how many years ago?
Okay, so I actually came on staff here in 2005. I was brought on. I was ordained through the Presbyterian Church, and so I've been here since 2005, which is 15 years now. But
Wow.
our senior pastor at the time got cancer in around 2010. And so from about 2011 on, at end of 2010, 2011, I've been serving as kind of one of the lead pastors at the church. Officially became the lead pastor and was voted on by the congregation in 2013, the very beginning of 2013. And so, yeah, I've been physically the pastoral role, senior pastor role since 2013, but in serving as a pastor church since 2005.
So does your son have a memory of any other church or any other setting?
He has a vague, like, probably, I would even say it's realistic. I think he just in his mind, he thinks of other places, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's cool. So the whole family, yeah. I mean, I barely remember my dad was on staff at a church when I was really little, and maybe it's memories that I made up. You know what I mean? Like,
That's what's hard to always know is, like, is it pictures he sees of like other buildings or whatever that he thinks, kind of takes on himself. I don't know. So, because he had only been one. So yeah.
Skip back even farther. How did you become a follower of Christ?
Yeah, no, good question. I grew up by God's grace in a church, a setting where the gospel was preached every Sunday. My dad was not a believer. My mom was a believer. She, I think, really followed Christ as a young girl, but kind of had a period of time where she was kind of living for the things of the world. And God did a pretty amazing thing by my dad kind of having it out with the religion, if I could say it this way, that he grew up in, which was the Catholic religion. And so my mom said, well, I want the boys to go to some church. So at that point, a church planter actually came knocking on our door, and my mom says, I'll send them to that church. And so we all started getting bussed into a church plant. And so I would guess I've been kind of rooted in church planting from the very young age. And it was there that I heard the gospel. I remember in a Sunday school class specific, the teacher was talking about the consequences of sin and hell and the eternal judgment. Scared the bejeebers out of me. But, I just kind of wrestled with it internally. And it was, for some reason, I remember being at my aunt's house and on her steps that led up to the upstairs. And I was really wrestling with what we learned that Sunday. I don't know why I happened to be at my aunt's that Sunday, but I just remember really feeling the need to confess Christ as my Savior. And I think as every young kid, you kind of wrestle with what that looks like. And so I hate to say it this way, but you pray that sinner's prayer a billion times.
Yeah.
But that's the time I really recognized that it resonated with me. And I think it was probably after that period into my early teens that I really started reading the Bible on my own. Was surrounded by some really good brothers in Christ who were all about my age. We got into theology. We were kind of weird in a lot of ways because we were all pretty athletic, and yet we were all very passionate about scripture and theology. And so I think growth-wise, all of that was contained in probably about an 8-year bubble. Yeah. And so God did some pretty cool stuff. And it was shortly thereafter my high school graduation that I really felt compelled, or just prior to my high school graduation, I really felt compelled to go to a Christian college. I was accepted at Michigan State University to study sports medicine, but felt God calling me to a little school called Clearwater, and I was going to study ministry. And so that's kind of my whole testimony there in a real quick snapshot.
That's awesome. So what was the turning point that just was there anything specific that got you off the Michigan State train? Praise God.
I had to do an interview because I was going to be working with the athletic department.
Yeah.
So I had to go down there, do a first person-to-person interview. And I did that. I did really well. I was told I was getting in for the athletic scholarship and stuff to go work with the athletic teams and that. and because I was going to study sports medicine, like I said. But I driving home, there's this overwhelming flood of emotion that this wasn't what I felt like God wanted me to do with my life. And the ironic part of that is that's exactly what my brother does do. I think that's why I thought, well, sports medicine. He was around sports athletes. He financially did pretty well for himself. He was, there was some age gaps, so I got to see his blessings of being able to travel and work with all different types of sports and travel and stuff. And I thought, wow, that'd be really good. But when I had that drive back, I just remember being overwhelmed. And I remember having to talk to my parents and say, I don't think this is what I want to do. And believe it or not, I mean, God showed a lot of grace because, like I said, my father at that point was not a believer, and he encouraged me to go for what I felt like I needed to do. So here I was enrolled in a school I didn't really have. I grew up in a public school background, so I didn't really have an understanding of what Christian college was going to be like. I remember, Dave, walking into my first college classroom and the professor doing a devotion and praying before class. I'd never experienced that in a classroom setting before. It blew me away, and I thought, man, this is what I want to do. And was mentored by I call the man my spiritual father, Brian Johnson. He, to this day, is still like my spiritual dad. He mentored me and just poured into me. And so a lot of my roots were founded. He was in charge of admissions, but he also taught some history classes and things like that on campus. And he just really poured into me. I literally slept at his house. Him and his wife let me hang out at his house. I'm friends with his kids on Facebook to this day. I mean, just really made an impact in my life for the good of the kingdom.
Brian Johnson.
Yep.
Is he still living?
Still living. Yeah. He's old, but he's still living. I teach him
Brian Johnson, if you ever watch this, you have no idea how far reaching those little seeds you planted. That's such a cool thing. I just get pumped thinking about all those little people who just plowed, because as I know, Aaron, we've been able to be around each other, and I've seen his hand by God's grace in different church plants in Detroit and different places like that. And just to think about how cool it is that Brian Johnson, in God's economy, he's not forgotten the investment that Brian Johnson placed. That's awesome, dude.
So cool. I mean, I don't want to take up too much time with that, but
I
think, I think Brian, and if this is any help to your members, the impact we have on another person is profound. And here, I didn't grow up with a spiritual dad, as I said like 3 or 4 times in this interview already. But man, I learned so much about what it was to be a godly father. Brian, I watched him. He was working on. I'll never forget this. At Christmas, he was working on a devotional he had been writing on all year for his kids. He wanted to give them in January, and I'd never seen anything like that in my life. A dad sitting out writing hand devotions for your kids for an entire year.
Wow.
And that really impacted me. And it just like I said, just what it was to be a spiritual dad, what it was to really have a passion for Christ, for the gospel. He would go to the prisons. I think that's where I started getting involved in prison ministry. I got involved in detention centers through him. So kind of created a hunger for the fact that we need to think about, the least, the lost of society.
Dude, that's incredible. That makes me, the problem inside of me about self-management is I think I need to write a devotional for my kids now. I'm like, that's such a great testimony, dude. That's so cool. What a great thing. Okay. So tell me now, about you come to pastor this church, and obviously there are a lot of pastors and a lot of churches, of established churches, that have been around a while, who don't necessarily find themselves with a front burner heart desire for church planting. Where did the desire to plant churches begin for you?
Well, that's a great question as well, because I don't think that began me walking through the door of First Pres. Now, First Pres was planted itself 117 years ago. It's really a revitalization, right? I always like to say it was planted 117 years ago, so obviously I didn't plant it. So I wasn't the planter. I'm the revitalizer, right? But I think the desire for church planting came in me much earlier. Like I said, I was part of a plant. I didn't realize that as a young kid. So I got to be part of a small church that was trying to grow. I got to see what it was like to try to reach out to the neighbors and all those things. But then I think being in Bible college with Brian and being involved in some of the early church plants, I helped a church plant that was started out of a funeral home. That's a pretty cool place to start a church plant. But it's got kind of a churchy feel. So we did that in Florida. And then I think a lot of the passion came for church planting while I was with seminary in RTS in Charlotte, North Carolina. There was just a heavy emphasis on church planting. And I really started thinking through those things probably about that time. So you're talking around the early 2000s was when I was in seminary. And, I started seminary probably late 90s, early 2000s, where I was really going wild at it. And I was really impacted by the idea that the gospel needs to be, the evangelism needs to be done, and gospel work needs to be done in America as much as around the world. And so I think church planting really struck me as God's means to do that as you read through the book of Acts. All that to say, all of those things were kind of happening inside of me. And then when I came to First Pres, I saw a church that really had a passion for missions. And I realized that a lot of their mentality, though, was missions was foreign. Across the pond, so to speak. And I was really trying to hope to see that redirected to local as well, more of a balanced 50-50 kind of mentality. And so I really started at that time articulating all the things that I'd already seen from my undergrad days to my growing up days to seminary days, and sharing that passion that I had. And that kind of grew into a kind of a movement at our church. First Pres, because it was in need of revitalization as an older church, I think had some really bumps in the road. There were some times, I think, in the history of it that even in the more recent history when I was there, when we were wondering, is this church going to be able to stay alive as we were losing people and people were going away from it. And I was brought in to kind of help anchor at least some of the younger people, if you will. I mean, I was brought on as a young pastor, right? But the idea that what I saw was a need for clear mission and vision. And I think that's what really excited me, was that they had a big idea that mission mattered, but they missed, if you will, Jerusalem or Judea. They were only focused on Samaria and the uttermost parts of the world. And so in that, and seeing the role that church planting played in the book of Acts, I was able to articulate that. And the church quickly bought on, and it kind of galvanized us together on mission as a church. And it was one of the most beautiful stories was when you see some of your oldest members fighting for church planting to have a larger portion of your budget. That's when you realize they've caught the vision. That was the exciting stuff, I think, that happened over that period of time for us at First Pres. And it's, like I said, 2005 to 2010 was just kind of getting stabilized in my own understanding. 2011 till about, I'd say at least 2018, we were really formulating what it looked like to be a church planting church. And I'd say by 18, 19, and 20, we really started to have a firm foundation and a kind of a process of how we do that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So now that you've got some years under your belt doing it, obviously you're young enough that hopefully there'll be many more ahead of you, but what has been the most exciting part of trying to be a church planting church so far?
Yeah, I think first it's watching people in your church buy into the vision, right? So for us, it's making an investment in church planting, maturing church planters, and multiplying churches. Those are our 3 M's. And so when we look at first making investment, the early days, it was just moving some foreign mission money over to help sustain church plants. One of the earliest ones we got involved with was Restore Church in Detroit. We just started funding them. Another one was Epiphany Fellowship Church in Camden, New Jersey, Pastor Doug. And so those relationships to this day have greatly impacted me about what it means to be a church planter. I've learned from both of those churches, both of those leaders, and they have developed who I am. And I think, so making an investment, but then, okay, now taking the next plunge, which was, let's start maturing planters. Our first church planter, we did everything wrong we could possibly do. We didn't know what we were doing. We were trying to figure this out. We planted a church in Dearborn, Michigan, Jeremy Roth, and he was our first church planter. I always joke, every mistake we could have made, we made with Jeremy, but we only got better as we went by, you know? And so we learned as we grew. And then the final goal was to really see the multiplication of churches. And I think now when we look back, we can see daughter churches, and we're starting to see even the desire that some of these daughter churches are starting to seek ways to get pregnant, so to speak, so that they can reproduce. And we're going to have some granddaughter churches. So that's been pretty exciting to kind of watch happen.
Yeah, that is exciting. Yeah, and I it's weird to think about how that's all materialized, because we met at Restore, in the upstairs of Restore.
Yeah.
And we went to Brooklyn and then went to Camden together in 2013. And just some of the ways that those partnerships you've had also were a part of my life. It's just a huge encouragement, investment. And many of you, I think there are a number of people in our congregation who know Jeremy. I'm not sure if they were members or visited Redeemer. I can't remember now how it played out. I think a couple different families. So anyway, okay. So what has been the hardest though? What's been the hardest part?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of it is the cost. What I mean by that is not the financial cost, but the commitment.
Yeah.
That there is a weight, because you're carrying the weight of another church, other families with you. There's the idea that we think we can plant and be done quickly. That used to be the model, 3 years and done. I think the areas we've particularly kind of picked for planting have been more what we call hard to reach places, church and hard planting in hard places. And those places require a lot more resources, time, energy, patience. It's a slow burn. As Pastor Doug says, we're not cooking in a microwave. You know, we're cooking in a crock pot, slow burn. You know, and so it's going to be a while. And I think sometimes people buy in, and you get that excitement for a year or 2 years or maybe 3 years. But what about year 4, 5, 6? Because there becomes this tension, like, well, we'd love to be able to do these other things. And I think finishing well on things is important. A lot of our churches we planted in the time that I've been doing this, we've had a residency program established where we've had a lot of different planters come through that. One is from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and that church has taken off. I mean, Ann Arbor is a beast in itself. But then you look at some of our churches that we planted, let's say in Detroit. We have 2 churches we planted in Detroit. The newest one is still trying to get its legs under it. The other one has been established now for 3 years, but it only has probably about 30, 40 people. And so it takes time to really to galvanize and develop that core team, and to be able to really grow and flourish. By God's grace, we've watched God provide buildings. We've watched God provide all kinds of resources, training, finances for seminary. God does a lot of things, but I think your question is, what is the hardest? It's about being patient and staying the course and understanding that you need to endure.
Yeah. So people that are watching this, the ones that watch when we have it on YouTube won't have seen James's, but there's a friend of mine who I interviewed who's going to closed access, unengaged places. And one of the things I thought he did a phenomenal job of was reminding us of evangelism is maybe the thing that draws our attention at first, but the arc of the Great Commission is far longer and larger than that. So that these church plants, it's not like they're just trying to see people get saved. They're trying to see a body of mature believers form. That doesn't happen overnight. You might be able to have a rally and gather a crowd in a night, but to build a Christ-like congregation is a long project, and we have to have. That's good. Perseverance is. I've been being reminded of that, especially because even my own disposition, personality.
This may sound crazy, David, but I don't think raising the support for that initial thrust to get a church out the door has been difficult at all.
Yeah.
By God's grace, we've been able to raise funds from a lot of different resources. By God's grace, He's put people in our way that have shared a passion or a vision for that particular planter or that particular area and have come on board. And we've seen some crazy things. Like I said, we've seen We've seen guys come in and buy buildings for us. We've seen situations where people have come in and bankrolled somebody's seminary education. We've seen situations where large chunks of money came in at just the right moment. It's the long sustaining, keeping everybody understanding that we're in it for the long haul. That's vision leaks, right? And so you're constantly having to keep everybody focused on what is the goal. And I think for a church like us, that's 117 years old, that has had a long history for missions, you think, well, of course they're just gonna just be totally, supportive to it. And I think we have, but it's reminding people that as we care for these missionaries around the world globally, we also need to be caring for these other churches locally, and in the same way, and give the same kind of love and care and compassion to both. And I think that's what we've been doing.
That's great. That's great. So now think about you talked about vision and vision leaking. And so tell me the dream, the question I usually ask guys is, what is the future you're praying toward? So what's the ideal, the big arc?
Yeah. So I'll go back to our 3 M's. We want to make investments. So we continue to make investments in other churches, not just the ones we plant. We try to support other plants. We always have a budget where we're trying to do that. So if you know of churches, always tell them to come talk to me. I can't promise that we'll have resources at the moment, but we try to get them on our waiting list. And the next is we're trying to mature planters. If we know young guys who want to come forward to be trained for planting, that's something we want to keep going and keep developing, keep getting better at. But then I think the thing you're driving to is, what is my big passion? It's the multiplication aspect of churches, and that I want to see really downriver changed. I want to see Michigan changed. As you know, I'm right now currently serving as the Acts 29 director for the state of Michigan, and I'm passionate about seeing Michigan. I'm passionate about seeing.
I forgot.
I got a heavy passion about Michigan, because Michigan is very unique in a couple of respects. It has a large rural context, which just so happens one of our next planters wants to plant in Nashville, Michigan. I didn't even know where Nashville, Michigan was. Right. And you realize how small the population is there, but that's what most of Michigan is. It's rural, right? And then you have these places like Flint or Detroit or Ann Arbor that are heavily populated. And then you also have the suburbia. So Michigan's its own beast. And of course, being a Midwestern place, I just have a passion that the gospel be rooted here. And we do a good job with that. But then I think the thing God's really been hitting on me as I've been praying is our global vision, that when we talk about foreign missions, I think we need to think about foreign church planting. Yeah. And where I thought this was probably going to come about was I really thought God was leading me towards maybe Africa. And I had a couple of connections there through some Bible translating, through a Bible college that we work with. And I thought, okay, this is what God's going to have us do, is go and train these people with a translation of the Bible for them, and specifically do some church planting training. And that didn't come to fruition as I thought it was. What God ended up doing was opening the floodgates in Europe for us. And so as a church, we've been heavily investing in Europe. We are invested in a church plant called Middlesbrough. It's called New Life Church in Middlesbrough, England. And so I've already been over there quite a few times, just helping to support and encourage that church. We sent a resident who did a year's residency there. Our goal is to start helping a church in Inverness, Scotland, so the Highlands of Scotland, and we're helping there. Both of those are in what we call schemes, so they're hard to reach, hard to plant areas, and we're ministering to both those churches. And we're also now looking over in Ireland, and so we have those 3 places already kind of captured in our mind. We're trying not to take off more than we can chew. We're trying to be faithful to New Life in Middlesbrough, and also be faithful to this church plant in Inverness. But eventually I could see us also working in Ireland. And so ironically, my next big bite will be a vision tour to take churches like yours and other churches that would be interested in supporting works like this. We partner with a ministry I'm sure you're familiar with, 20 Schemes. And so that's Mez McConnell's group. And so what we're
Yeah,
doing
let me
is,
give a brief,
yeah,
basically, Resurrection Church, if you don't know, some of you know of 20 schemes, but a scheme is like a housing project. And in Scotland and England, and maybe in Ireland as well, there's a ministry where their goal is to plant churches within the housing projects. They're actually more clearly defined communities, it seems, whereas the projects might be a couple blocks. This is a little community that's been built of council estates, or they're called schemes. And Mez McConnell is really a tremendous resource, and a guy who was saved out of a context like that, who's been leading the charge to go back into that. And yeah, I would love if some of you in our church have read The Creaking on the Stairs. We read that together, and Mez is the author of that book, just to connect another dot. So anyway, that's
yeah.
what we're trying to talk about.
No, that's great, because you think about Mez McConnell and you think about 20 schemes. They primarily only work in Scotland. New Life Hope, which is in northern England, that's Middlesbrough, that technically is not part of 20 schemes, although Ian Williamson, the pastor there, does do some teaching for the Rugged School. And so Ian Williamson is our planter that we support. And he's a huge man, like a bouncer. He was actually a bouncer in a former life, got radically saved, and God's got a hold of him. And as you've heard the story of Mez, these guys, I mean, it's amazing to see what God's doing through men like Ian Williamson, Mez McConnell. And what's happening there in Scotland is also needed in England. It's also needed on Ireland. And so what we're doing is trying to figure out ways that we can support and come alongside these churches. We're picking specific churches that match up very well with us and what we're about. Ian Williamson's was a very quick, just God moment that we recognized after we started walking through the steps to do that. We saw more and more at what a good fit this was for our church. And we feel the same way about Chris Davison up there in Inverness with the marriage scheme where he serves, and just excited about that opportunity of what God's doing there. And so these are kind of like, okay, these are the next big steps.
Yeah.
This is requiring a lot of prayer. It requires a lot of resources. But the steps, like I was saying, the next steps is actually a vision tour to get other churches to go with us for about a 2-week trip to visit each of these sites so you can see why this is so needed. We often think of, does Europe really need the gospel? And yes, just like Trenton, Michigan needs the gospel, Europe desperately needs the gospel. Yeah. And we need to understand that just because the Reformation came out of there doesn't mean that the next generations that followed all are walking with Jesus. And so obviously we can look and see kind of the spiritual depravity that's going on in those places that desperately need the gospel. And so I think we have a responsibility to not look past Europe and just look at places like Africa or Asia, but to actually look and see the responsibility we have as much there as here as the rest of the globe. And so I think that for us is the next step.
That's great. And just churches, you think about this. The Apostle John wrote 5 probably New Testament letters in relationship to the church at Ephesus, right? The letter, well, not just the Apostle John, but there were 5 letters. So John's 3 letters, the book of Revelation, and then obviously the letter from Paul to the Ephesians. And I want you to think about how the church in the region of Ephesus in modern day Turkey is doing now, right? It's very much the minority. It's in a Muslim dominated place, and I'm sure the Spirit is working. But why do I say that? I say that because at one point, the Apostle John, Jesus' best friend, was leading the church there. Think about that. That's the same logic to say, well, Turkey doesn't need anybody. There was, they used to have all this move. Well, John Knox used to be in Scotland too, but he's not there anymore, right? There needs to be generation upon generation of moves to these places because the Western world is not the same as it might have once been, and England and Scotland are really mission fields. When sadly, but also, hey, you can't do anything about the fact that there are many churches that have lost the gospel there. Now we need to see both a revival in some and then replanting of new. Okay, so I love it. And Resurrection Church, that's a project that's on my mind, is the idea of where are we going, not just because we can't just plant locally. We have to see the gospel advanced globally. And for Resurrection, we talk about Jesus to everyone in reach, Jesus over everything in our lives. That's my hat, right? And then Jesus worshiped among every people and in every place. And this is where we need to be thinking about, where is God opening doors for Resurrection to see him worshiped among other peoples and worshiped in other places. So, yeah, okay, let me go with the next question. How, as Resurrection Church is trying to do this, what are some tips, what are some words of counsel for a church that's trying to strengthen its legs as a church planting church from one who's doing that as well, maybe a decade ahead of us?
Yeah, I think one of the things I often say to churches that are, and I'm going to use the word revitalize. I know you guys are kind of in this weird place of planting, revitalizing, but for every church, I think you have to be willing to take a risk. What I mean by this is people say, well, we're too small, we're too poor, we're too whatever to plant. You're not. Mm-hmm. Everybody should be getting in the game of planting now, because even if it's just $50 a month a church donates to another church, that's important. Even if it's just caring for the planter, and the only thing you guys do is give the planter and his wife some date nights, you're serving the kingdom of God, right? So we can serve in small ways, we can serve in giant ways, where we're writing whole checks to cover a whole big mission. The point is, we're never too small, we're never too old, we're never too new to be involved in church planting. Yeah. And I think this is an important perspective. And so what I would say to your church is, don't think that church planting is something you'll do down the road. Think about, how can we be getting involved in it now? And that would be my first real encouragement. The second one is, begin to brainstorm with, where is God leading you? I think that was the thing that we really worked with at First Pres, was we knew that ultimately we felt led that God was opening doors for us to make those investments in places like Restore Church in Detroit. And then we felt invested in what was happening in Camden, New Jersey. For us, right out of the gate, we were invested in churches in hard to reach places. And so that became part of what we eventually saw that God was having us to be involved with. But God also threw us a church planter in Ann Arbor, and it was like, wow, that was, and I'm going to say that was easy, because he works really hard to plant in Ann Arbor, but in comparison to what some of the struggles are happening in Detroit, they're different, right? Yep. They're just really different struggles. And so we have to be mindful that we're also not going to pigeonhole ourselves and say, we only plant this, we only do this. We've tried to be sensitive to where God's leading, recognizing that we were building an identity of what we were going to be about, but also sensitive to when things came our way, we were going to jump on board with what God opened the door to. And so our track record has been, we'll help pretty much any gospel-centered preacher who really feels that he is in need of help to either be trained, supported, or even is willing to, start a whole new work. So we just want to be involved in investing in the kingdom work, I guess, what I'm really trying to say. And I would encourage your church to have the same mindset. Yeah. Just really be willing to be invested.
And what's good is, to Resurrection Church's credit, I just praise the fact that some of the guys that you partner with, we've partnered with, where we sent different things to Drew Ainsley and to Ben Luthi and to Jason Aaron, and we are taking up with our Acts, because we're Acts 29 as well. So technically, this is my Acts 29, my boss or whatever. They don't pay me anymore. So, but we've taken up our 10% commitment to giving. But then also, I think that one of the things that we need to be thinking about is not just, we're young, therefore we can only give even. We need to be thinking about, Lord, would you open doors for us to actually plant a church, for us to send, or to either partner heavily or be the tip of the spear in a plant. I mean, I'm praying, that we, I can't remember what author or what person would say, but healthy churches are born pregnant. And I'm praying that we are pregnant with the gospel and looking for a place to plant. And I'm praying that God would raise up the right leader, that somebody would step forward who's showing the gifting and showing the burden and showing the burn in their soul for the lost. And So pray with me, church. Pray about that, all right? I got one quick follow, actually 2 quick follow-ups. They're short, okay? Why should, because I know, look over Aaron's shoulder, you can see a picture of a man. Who is that, Aaron? I know who it is.
B.B. Warfield, baby.
B.B. Warfield, all right? B.B. Warfield. Now, he is an old, dead theologian. Now, here's what I would ask for the young men in our church. Why, in like a 30-second answer, should they be reading old, dead men?
Well, Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun, right?
Yeah.
And so that's number one. So I remember when the Rob Bell thing came out and everybody was quickly gravitating, oh, this brand new theology. And when I compared what he was saying to, Machen, Machen was tearing him apart,
Right.
I remember the whole thing with Rob Bell was.
By the way, church members, J. Gressler Machen was Princeton, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. President of Princeton Seminary, a theologian that wrote probably his most famous work is Christianity and Liberalism.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, if you want to read Machen, that would be a great book to read. Anyway, that's who he's referring to.
No, I was going to go off on a rabbit trail. I'm glad you stopped me there. But I guess to your point, one of the things that Charles Hodge said is he said, may Princeton never say anything new. And I mean, he got bashed for that. I think there's been people who've attacked that because there's a sense in which theology is always evolving and growing. But I love the fact that he was unapologetic for saying, we're going to preach that old time gospel.
Oh, dude,
and I think that's sweet.
I think he's right on. Forget the people that say theology is not evolving. It is written. It is written. Now,
their argument is our understanding.
Yes, I know. But I still, the fact that I can hear Dave Doran Sr. in my heart, he's saying the goal has been to pass the deposit we received on to the next generation.
Amen.
That faithfulness of saying, okay, I received the word and I passed on the word, and that's all the baton is. That's great. Nothing new. I
think it's important, Dave, like especially to your younger people, is familiarize yourself with some of the old dead guys, because they're going to save you a ton of work as you have to read through what's on the Christian bookshelf today. There's so much. There's golden nuggets, and even what do they say, a broken clock is right at least twice a day.
Yeah.
And so you might read some really broken Christian books, and you might be able to get a nugget here or there. But ultimately, if you're reading the old dead guys and they've been tested and tried, there's a value to the fact that that book is still around, it's still sound, it's tested in time. And I just think one other thing is, so many of the new trendy pastors that write these books because they quickly get these book deals, and then we find out they had an affair on their wife. We find out that so much other things that were undergirding it starts to be exposed. Again, that's the benefit of the old dead guys, right? That there's gonna be no surprises that come out, or there shouldn't be anyway.
Or at least we know a lot of what their struggles were and consider. So think about. I think you're right. If the young guys that are watching this from our church, Tim Challies or 9 Marks or Together for the Gospel, they will, or TGC, they will write book reviews and they'll filter through arguments and stuff for you. But even then, there's actually a better filter. Like a good 250 years, none of the junk really rises to the top over the course of 300 years, 500 years. John Calvin is still read, but there was a ton of people who also wrote. But that's because his rose above that stuff. I mean, that's because there's a gift of saying, is this standing the test of time? You don't have to read a blogger to filter it out for you. You just think, what kind of stuff has endured? And in general, it's going to be the most excellent and helpful writing. So, okay, second follow-up to that. I don't think I've ever asked you this question, but a young guy wants to plant a church who watches this or from our church, and they say, they ask the question, why plant a church based on a confessional church? What's your answer? Or they're saying, should I?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. My argument is this: everybody has a confession of faith. Everybody does.
Yep.
The difference is not everybody's is written out exhaustively.
Yeah.
Right? So let's be truthful. When I visit church websites, I might get their 7 key principles that they live by, or or their pillars, their 4 pillars of the faith, or whatever they, their essentials, or whatever they want to call it. But what do they believe about all these other things matters too.
Yeah.
Because every church ultimately has a way they do communion. Every church has a belief about baptism. Every church has a view of the return of Christ. Every church has a view of Scripture. Every church has an understanding of the atonement, of the resurrection of the dead. All these things, and oftentimes they're not written out. So you start to attend these churches and you really don't know what they believe. So what do? You ultimately start saying, well, what does the pastor say?
Yeah.
What you've just done is you've crossed a very dangerous line, because now the pastor has become the pope of the church.
Yeah.
That we all believe whatever he tells us to believe. And I would rather tie myself to the historic confessions of the Reformation, where have been written by groups of men who've wrestled for years. My own confession, the Westminster Confession, which was mirrored later by the Baptists in the London Baptist Confession, was written by groups of men over long periods of time and wrestled with, right? So the benefit is, as I come and wrestle through that, I'm not taking that over Scripture. That's important to say, because a lot of people say, well, I don't need a confession of faith, or I don't need a creed but the Bible. Everybody has a creed.
Yeah.
It's how you interpret that Bible. The question is, has it been tested over time and by triads of men to make sure that it's consistent with orthodoxy? And so I don't care what confession of the Reformation you hold to per se. What I want to know is that that what you do believe is written out so the people of your church can look at it and hold each other accountable and hold their pastor accountable, and vice versa. Their pastor can hold them accountable. And the more thorough it is, the more detail it is, the more agreement, because that's what a confession really does. Its goal is to bring agreement. I hear this all the time. Well, confessions are going to divide. No, the intention of a confession is to unite. You're either going to unite around a pastor, or you're going to unite around what you believe the Bible says from a confession. It's one or the other.
It's so clear in Scripture that there was a shared faith, and that they rallied doctrinally around a shared body of belief. And what's interesting to me is, you're exactly right. I think I try to tell people, one professor that I had used to say that institutions are the lengthened shadow of a man. And one of the ways I say it at our church is that, like, the founding documents are a gift to the church in transition of leadership and transition of generations. The next generation might look and say, you know what, we're done with this. That's not but that's at least their blood be on their own heads. They have heard from the ones that went before them. This is what the word says. The next pastor might try and come in and lead against the grain of that thing, but the congregation is able to say, no. It wasn't just our pastor, but this is faithful that we've been handed down. And we have confidence that it wasn't just because when that pastor leaves and nothing's written down, and the next guy starts teaching something else, everybody's like, I don't know where to find what I know I feel like is wrong somewhere here. It's a gift for us to have these organized statements of faith, which are, so we're kind of halfway. I mean, the Second London Baptist Confession is connected to the New Hampshire, which is in America, and it's kind of been helpful. Another time when we're not recording, we can talk through.
No, and I think just a couple quick thoughts is, number one, if your congregation is familiar with Mark Dever in his book, The 9 Marks of a Healthy Church, talks heavily about the importance of constitution, right? Getting that and making sure everybody ties into that constitution. The constitution is thorough and guarded because it acts as a support for the church. It's not the pastor saying this, it's the Constitution. So that's what a confession does. It's your statement of faith. The other thing is, I would point a lot of your congregation to look at 2 websites. One is called the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. You'll find really good, solid biblical preachers and teachers there, but you're going to see that they're from different backgrounds: Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, conservative Lutheran. What reason is they're all saying, hey, confessions matter. That's what gave me the desire. When I'm going to bond with people, I want to bond with those who say the confessions matter. That hence the confessional collective. The other website would be Monergism. Monergism, which is a monergism.com. Or I think it's .org, but it's a great resource to see consistent preaching and teaching from good godly men. What you see is this unifying. much like the Gospel Coalition, much like Alliance Confessing Evangelicals, Monergism brings all of these great teachers and preachers together. You can listen to their sermons, read their articles, get a lot of the free books for the old dead guys we talked about. These resources are available because these men agree to something besides simply a couple of a brief statement.
Yeah.
It's more robust than that. That's what I'm trying to say.
No, I think it's good. And I think that it is very prideful, I think is maybe too strong, but I think maybe close enough for a young generation to think we know clearly enough which 5 things matter that will only measure people by those 5. Right? So when we say, oh, we're gonna just listen, this is all that matters. The rest of it, if you agree here, there's some use for that in some partnerships, but to say that we know that that's the only thing that matters, and I think that's one of the backgrounds. We're both Acts 29, but one of the major deficiencies was that Driscoll often talked about closed hand, open hand, as if there were no middle. And so you have closed hand, and that's like you're not a believer if you don't believe these. And then everything else is on this spectrum of just give it away. And I think the confessions actually have a lot better way of saying, like, well, there's closed hand, and then there's some things that we're holding on to. You might be able to be a believer if you believe differently about X, Y, or Z, in theory, but the idea that you want to actually, this system of theology has deep impact. And yes, then there also are things that we hold loosely. This is how we do it. I've always felt like that this is a good nuancing or response to that only closed hand, only open hand. Not that was intentional. It's just we only have 2 hands. Yeah. All right. So we've gone over time, but I think it's been fruitful. So I'm going to stop the recording, and then I will just thank you for your time, man. Thanks on behalf of the church.